Good morning, everybody. My name is Victoria Leyva, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Marxist feminism's perception on women's oppression and food production. So let's get started. So the reason I chose this topic was because prior to me being in this class, I had no idea what Marxist theory even was, let alone Marxist feminism. And so this research on this topic led me on a journey of realization of just how much capitalism is involved in every aspect of our life. And so the solutions to move past this capitalist movement obviously have to take into consideration these aspects and must be multimodal. Um, so just to get a broad introduction on what Marxist feminism is, it is a feminist theory that focuses on the way in which women are oppressed through the capitalist economic practices and the system of private property. And just to give a little bit more detail on the subject, in the 19th century, Marx was concerned with our freedom, which pushed him to look at the interaction between power and inequality. And he realized that this motivates societal change. He was inspired to look at or question our freedom because he realized that we are innately constrained by our basic needs to survive in the natural world. However, he also realized that once we free ourselves from the constraint of meeting our basic needs through the system of labor, we fall into the trap of being constrained by social limitations instead. And so Marx sees the world in terms of modes of production and economic classes, specifically the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. He sees it through modes of production, which is defined by the forces of production and the relations of production. So the forces of production are the technical and scientific and material parts of the economy. So for example, that would be the tools, the materials, the technology, and the human labor that allows these things to work. So an example from modern times would be the assembly line and mass production. As for the relations of production, this is referring to how people organize themselves around labor. For example, working for wages in comparison to making and selling your own goods. The relation of production is important because in capitalism, this determines how the surplus is used. And who determines how the surplus is used and how this determination comes about could lead and normally does lead to exploitation in capitalism through wage labor, where the working class is being paid less than the worth of what they produce if what they're producing is a surplus. And this creates a crisis of overproduction. This is the contradiction between the modes of production and the relations of production, where the forces of production are so developed that we are producing more than we need, and the majority of people can't even afford to buy it. So an example of that today would be food deserts and like, for example, at the beginning of this COVID-19 pandemic, there was an overproduction of milk in the markets. And, people were not able to purchase milk as often as they would like to because so many people were being laid off due to the pandemic. And so this shows historically how there's a tendency for the system of supply and demand to be out of whack. And this is what makes this class struggle between the bourgeoisie, who control the means of production by driving down wages and driving up productions as much as possible, while the proletariat or the working class does not have this freedom because the only thing that they have access to sell is their labor. An example of this would be how Renee mentioned last week how Starbucks says that their coffee beans are correctly sourced when in fact they're not. So this relates to women because, you know, back in the 19th century, women did not have a sense of autonomy or agency without the success of a man. So if the men weren't winning, then the women definitely weren't winning either. So to kind of segue into a brief history of Marxist theory. So before Marxist theory, we had feudalism, and this is a social structure between the serfs and the lords, where the serfs worked for the lords in exchange for land and protection. So in this system, there was no exchange of money. So the subordination was more personal and church sanctioned. And this kind of was highlighted by a lot of the presentations last week that mentioned how women are put into more supportive roles. And through those supportive roles, they're seen as subordinate and ultimately oppressed. And so during this time before capitalism, the serfs were in this constant rate of production that created a surplus that was being unequally distributed. So there was still hunger, even though there was plenty of food to go around. And this is similar to what Vandana Shiva was talking about in chapter 9 of our textbook. Where she pointed out that the way labor is organized leads to massive inequalities. And just from my own personal interpretation of what I learned while researching this topic, it seems like we are starting to come to the realization of how harmful capitalism actually is. And so attempting to escape the binds of capitalism would include women joining the workforce and getting rid of that whole idea of a woman's job versus a man's job. And also, people are starting to see the harm in monocultures, and people are starting to push more for locally sourced food instead. And to kind of mention that, women are responsible for half of the world's food production. Regardless of that, it has been shown that women are 27% more likely to suffer from severe food insecurity because of being disproportionately impacted by economic crises. And this is only further perpetuated by the discrimination of land rights, limited access to credit, education, and training. And this is discussed further in Cheryl Wu Dunn's TED Talk called Our Century's Greatest Injustice, where she shares a few stories about how women have been disproportionately oppressed. According to her calculations, about 60 to 100 million there are about 60 to 100 million missing females in the current population in the East. And she kind of delves into why that is. To kind of go into some personal example, she mentions the story of Daimanju, who is a girl that lived in the Dabian Mountains. Her and her family lived in a hut with no electricity, no running water, and no form of transportation other than their own 2 feet. In fact, they shared their home with a pig. And to make matters worse, her family was deciding to pull her out of school in the 6th grade because they said that the school fees were too much, and why spend the money if she's just going to spend her life in the rice paddies anyways. But Daimanju did not accept this, and she would walk 2 hours to school on her own anyways, and she would sit outside the doors to try and soak in as much knowledge as she possibly could, despite not actually being enrolled. And so there was a story written about her in the New York Times, and one man read it and decided to donate $10,000 to the school to pay for her education, along for scholarships for many other females in the community. So because she was given the opportunity to go to school, she excelled in elementary school, middle school, high school. She went to college. She went on to get a well-paid job, so much so that she was able to send money back to her family to help them build a better life. They got a new house with electricity and running water, and they got a bike to be able to get from point A to point B. And they no longer had to share a room with a pig, which was great. So basically, she moved out of that vicious cycle and transformed her life into a virtuous cycle. Another story that Cheryl Wu Dunn shares is about Beatrice Burra, who is a little girl that lives in Uganda. So she was 9 years old, and she had never gone to school because her parents said, why spend the money? She's just going to spend her life lugging water back and forth. Well, a church made a donation to their community, and her family benefited from it, and they were able to buy a goat, which started producing milk. They sold the milk, and they were able to meet their basic needs on a regular basis. So they decided, let's send her to school. So once again, she excelled in elementary, middle, and high school. She graduated from the University of Connecticut in the United States. All of this is to say that society initially believes that investing in women's futures and education is not needed because females from a young age are seen as a commodity, as a resource, whether it be a reproductive resource, like we're just here to make babies and to care for babies and do house chores, or whether it be for working in food production like Daimanju and Beatrice. And so Cheryl Wu Dunn ends her TED Talk by saying, it is important that we educate women and we give them more economic opportunities, because educating a woman allows her to, it's been statistically seen that women who are educated get married later on in life, have fewer kids, are less likely to suffer from poverty, and the kids that she does have, she will educate them better. And she also pointed out it's pointless to want to be the best at something, say in technology. You want to be the best in technological production or the best in food production, and to not use half of the resources that you are given. So to say that I'm only going to hire men for this technological position and not factor in all of these women that have just as much education and just as much potential, uh, you're selling yourself short at being the best. And so she emphasizes that a movement of men and women is what is needed to bring about social change that will address this great moral change. And to put a little bit more emphasis on the food production, Vandana Shiva, she did an interview titled What is Wrong with the System That Produces Our Food? And she basically says that our system is a negative production system, which uses more than it produces, and its only real aim is labor productivity, which causes a lack of biodiversity in our land and diets, which we believe we can fix with technology, but in reality, the majority of our technology, especially in the West, is mostly just used to kill. She mentions GMOs mostly as a use of biological warfare. She says our only solution is to produce food to meet our nutritional needs and make that process as close to the consumer or the source of life as possible. She also mentioned how it's important for the interaction of local and international powers. So local powers should be able to make decisions about the quality of the seeds, the food, and the land that is going to be used to produce food. And then international organizations should recognize and support the local powers instead of trying to regulate it so much that it's impossible to do the right thing. Lastly, she emphasizes that democracy is key because the interaction between the public consumer and the producer is what makes this system so efficient. And an example of someone who's already doing that is Vivian Sansour. So she is creating what is called a seed library, where she is collecting heirloom seeds and distributing them to a lot of the local farmers in her area in Palestine. So she's doing this because she wants to help bring back biodiversity to the land and the diet of her community. As emphasized by Vandana Shiva, she treats her organization like a democracy by meeting with the local farmers that produce her food and asking them what do they need to produce more successfully, and she allows them to explore different techniques that could also help them produce food better. Also, one of the more important tenets of her work is the way that her and her community view the land and food. It's more emphasis on a reciprocal relationship rather than using the land to get what you want, the way that we kind of think about things in the Western world. And so, kind of how I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's easy to make connections to other aspects of feminism in Marxism and capitalism. So intersectionality. Marx emphasized that it's not just about class. His ideas also expand to gender and race. Religion, how I mentioned about the history of feudalism and that whole perspective, it kind of is still a thing for, if you look at the way that stay-at-home moms work, there is a lack of separation between work life and home life, and it just keeps women oppressed in this constant state of production and subordination, especially through church-sanctioned supportive roles and through scripture. Also, of course, ecofeminism and the gender pay gap, how women have joined the workforce but don't share equal benefits with the men that they work with. Um, a lot of the tenets of Marxist feminism follows the tenets of anti-globalization, where anti-globalization advocates for natural environment and human rights. Also, in the hashtag Me Too movement, women have been capitalized and taken advantage of in the workplace and so many more aspects of their life. And through all of these aspects of our lives, women are fighting back to try and take control and do the right thing. And so, to do the right thing, solutions include educating women. Like Cheryl Wu Dunn had mentioned, there's so many benefits to educating a girl. As Liam had mentioned in his presentation, to help close the gender pay gap, it's important to disclose salaries to keep managers and employers accountable for how they are dividing profits. Investing in females' future, both locally and institutionally. We can all say that we're going to contribute a few dollars to women and girls in less fortunate situations. However, it's also really important for these institutions to come to the realization that women's futures are important as well, and to take advantage of those resources as well. And also, we need to change our economic system to a democracy instead of running it on capitalism, because if everyone is involved and is aware and is a part of the decision-making process, this inequitable hierarchy is less likely to occur. And these are my sources. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and thank you for your time.